The South Wales valleys in the mid-20th century were a landscape shaped by industry. The hills, once green and wild, were now punctuated by the towering wheels of coal mines and the dark, man-made mountains of their waste. These were the spoil tips, unstable piles of rock, slate, and dust, a byproduct of the coal that fueled a nation. In the borough of Merthyr Tydfil, nestled in the Taff Valley, was the village of Aberfan. Its very name is thought to mean place of the magical stream, a cruel irony for what was to come. Like so many villages, its identity and heartbeat were tied to the local pit, the Merthyr Vale Colliery. It was a tight-knit community where generations of the same family worked underground, and children grew up in the shadow of the industry that supported them. But on October 21st, 1966, that shadow would come to life with a terrible destructive force. For decades, the waste from the Merthyr Vale Colliery was simply dumped on the slopes of Minded Merthyr, the mountain directly above the village. There were 7 such tips. The one that would become infamous was known simply as Tip 7. Started in 1958, it had grown to a monstrous height of 111 feet. But its danger wasn't just in its size, it was in its very foundation. The underlying geology of the area was porous sandstone, a rock riddled with natural underground springs and streams. Local farmers had long complained about water issues caused by the tips. Astonishingly, and in direct contravention of the National Coal Board's own guidelines, Tip 7 was established directly on top of this known water source. For years it sat there, a saturated, unstable threat looming over the village, a danger recognized by some but ignored by those in power. The stage was set for catastrophe. Final trigger was a period of exceptionally heavy rain. For 3 weeks prior, the valleys had been soaked, saturating the ground and filling the springs beneath Tip 7 to bursting point. On that fateful Friday morning, the village was shrouded in a thick mist. At Pantglas Junior School, the day had just begun. It was the last day before the half-term holiday, and a palpable excitement was in the air. Lessons had started for many. It was a math class. At around 9:05 a.m., a low, deep rumble began to build, a sound that witnesses would later describe as being like a jet engine or continuous thunder. Then, the side of the mountain gave way. An estimated 140,000 cubic yards of liquefied coal waste, a thick, viscous, and fast-moving slurry, broke free. It wasn't a slow slide, it was an avalanche moving at speed down the hillside. It devoured everything in its path, destroying 2 farm cottages and, critically, smashing through 2 water mains buried in its trajectory. This added thousands of gallons of fresh water to the mix, turning the slide into an even more devastating tidal wave of liquid mud and debris. The primary force of the avalanche was directed squarely at the Pantglas area of the village. The wave of spoil, now over 30 feet high in places, slammed into the back of the Pantglas Junior School. The force was immense. It demolished and flooded the school's assembly hall in seconds and engulfed classrooms, burying children and teachers alive under a thick, suffocating mass that quickly began to solidify, trapping them in a tomb of mud and rubble. The adjacent secondary school was also damaged, and 18 houses on Moy Road and other nearby streets were utterly destroyed. In moments, the sounds of children at play were replaced by an eerie, deafening silence, broken only by the desperate screams of those who had witnessed the unimaginable. Inside the classrooms, acts of incredible heroism unfolded. Deputy Headmaster Dai Bainan was found with 5 children, a blackboard in his hand, in a futile attempt to shield them. Dinner lady Nancy Williams used her own body to protect 5 pupils, who all survived, she did not, and was found still clutching a pound note for school lunch money. Ilzibattle Headmaster Dai Bainan was found with 5 children, a blackboard in his hand, in a futile attempt to shield them. Dinner lady Nancy Williams used her own body to protect 5 pupils, who all survived, she did not, and was found still clutching a pound note for school lunch money. The response was instinctual and immediate. Fathers and mothers who had just waved their children off to school now ran towards the devastation, digging with their bare hands into the still shifting slurry. They were soon joined by miners from the Merthyr Vale Colliery, still in their work clothes, who used their pit props to shore up the wreckage as they tunneled, fearing a further collapse. Police, firefighters, and ambulance crews arrived, but the scene was one of almost impossible chaos. The consistency of the spoil made rescue agonizingly slow. It was like digging into wet concrete. As news spread via the BBC, thousands of volunteers from across South Wales and beyond descended on Aberfan, their goodwill overwhelming the narrow valley roads and at times hampering the coordinated efforts of the trained rescue teams. For hours, the desperate digging continued. One of the last glimmers of hope came with the rescue of 8-year-old Jeff Edwards. Pinned by his desk for 2 agonizing hours, surrounded by his deceased classmates, he was finally spotted by a firefighter thanks to his blonde hair peeking out from the rubble. He was the 10th and final child to be brought out alive. As the rescue effort transitioned to a recovery operation, the full scale of the loss became horrifically clear. A temporary mortuary was set up in Bethania Chapel where the heartbreaking task of identification began. Parents were led in one at a time to identify their children, a procession of unimaginable grief. The anger was palpable. At the coroner's inquest, one bereaved father who had lost his wife and two sons shouted out, "No, sir, buried alive by the National Coal Board." A mass funeral for 81 of the children was held days later, attended by 10,000 people, a sea of collective mourning. The official tribunal of inquiry, led by Lord Justice Edmund Davies, was unequivocal. The disaster was caused by the ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure of communication by the National Coal Board. The NCB chairman, Lord Robins, was heavily criticized for his attempts to downplay the board's responsibility. Yet, in a decision that compounded the community's pain, no individuals or the board itself were ever prosecuted. Even more controversially, the NCB forced the Public Disaster Fund money donated from around the world for the victims and their families to contribute £150,000 towards the cost of removing the remaining tips. The people of Aberfan were, in effect, forced to pay for the cleanup of the corporation's negligence. The trauma inflicted on Aberfan was not just immediate, it was generational. Survivors and residents suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. A local doctor later documented that the village became a place of excessive sickness, with survivors reporting lifelong struggles with anxiety, depression, and guilt. In the year following the disaster, the death rate among the close relatives of the victims was 7 times higher than normal, a stark statistic of broken hearts. The Queen, who visited days after the tragedy and later expressed regret for not coming sooner, has said that Aberfan was the single most sorrowful event of her reign. Yet from this profound darkness emerged a story of incredible resilience. The global outpouring of support, with over 50,000 letters of condolence and donations from around the world, showed the people of Aberfan they were not alone. They used that support to rebuild, not just their village, but their community spirit. The story of Aberfan is a permanent stain on British industrial history, a stark lesson in the cost of placing profit and convenience above safety and human life. It is the story of a fight for justice that was never fully won, and above all, it is the story of 144 souls, most of them young children, whose futures were stolen on a quiet morning in October. A community was scarred forever, but it was never broken.